very good question. I know the scholars have had a lot of fun with that. Let me answer it this way, sort of putting it back on your shoulders. If you read more and more of my stories, you might look for the mother-daughter relationships. Dead country people, for example. There's a daughter whose given name was Joy, J-O-Y. But she's gone off to some fancy school and got herself a PhD in philosophy and changed her name to Holga. And she and her mother don't exactly get along too well. She's rejected religious belief. Her mother holds a religious belief. But Holga she lost part of her leg in a shotgun accident, has what you would now call prosthesis. Has a heart problem. The teacher might want to play with the symbolism of that too. And isn't really able to work. Somebody could be diagnosed with a terrible cancer, and the patient would not be told that it was cancer. The fear was if they know what it is, they might pass faster than if they didn't know. I don't know that the theory ever proved itself. But in the 1940s and 50s, you would have that. I think I saw a hand over here someplace. Yes?
Yeah. What was your goal in writing your stories? Like, what do you want your readers to get out of it?
Oh, another good question. I sometimes said that the South was the last place in the country that knew what sin was. And I think I wanted that to be known. I tried not to sound like somebody preaching from a pulpit. I think only in the story called Displaced Person is there even, where do you suppose that came from? Somehow all of a sudden she becomes deeper. Maybe that doesn't hold up too well, but confronted with something more ultimate, a sociopathic killer, she can claim common connection to them. Don't we sometimes hear people say, I was so shocked when so-and-so was arrested for murder. It seemed like such a normal person. And I think she was recognizing that, and she reaches out, touches him. There's a plaster one. But then his comment at the end is rather interesting, isn't it? She would have been a good woman if there had been someone there to shoot her all the time. If we confronted the fact of our finiteness, that we do not have forever to live and do justice, if we understood that, we might act differently. Keep in mind what's really important and what's secondary.
Like 3 of her stories, and they've all been like Gothic themes. What other genres did she write in?
You've
Say.
about seen it. Oral Roberts was this healing minister in Oklahoma. And one woman wrote and said she had an idea for a musical comedy about the Civil War, but because she wasn't trained in literary type writing, would I write it for her? Now these are the kind of characters that I would have invented, and that's about as close as I would want to get to them. Anyway, my birds. You can actually find a video in this computer world showing that somebody came and took film of me because I had trained a chicken to walk backwards. That way the chicken could see where it had gone. And over time I acquired quite a number of birds, geese, pheasants, ducks. Probably the ones best known to most people were the peacocks and peahens. They came later. I even had a pet quail. They all had names, by the way. My pet quail was named after Amelia Earhart, a flyer who disappeared back in the 1930s. Kind of scared the neighbors one day when my quail had disappeared, and all of a sudden I found her and said, "I found Amelia Earhart." Little did they know. I went to as a progressive school. I might talk more about that later, or you can ask me. One of the things I had to do was make some clothing. I told the teacher, "I've already got enough clothes, but could I make clothes for a good friend of mine?" And in this progressive system, if you had an idea, the teacher would go with it, and she said, "Sure." So I made clothes for Amelia Earhart. Brought her to class. I passed. So much for education. I had a rooster named Haile Selassie, who was the emperor of Ethiopia. I named another rooster Adolf, but my timing wasn't very good, so I changed the name. Had a chicken named Aloysius. Being Irish, of the Irish descent, I thought an Irish name would be good. So you'll find some work with real estate and change jobs from time to time, always in real estate. And about the time I was 12, he took a federal job in Atlanta, so we moved to Atlanta. But my mother didn't really like Atlanta very well. It was too big. I didn't like Atlanta too well either. So we ended up moving kind of in two stages to Milledgeville, Georgia, where I lived a good deal of my life. At one point, Milledgeville was the capital of Georgia until I think 1877 or something like that, before it moved to Atlanta. And we did move back briefly to Atlanta. That was my first time to be in a public school. I went to parochial Catholic schools in Savannah. Didn't much like the nuns, but that was what they gave us. And then we moved back to Milledgeville, and my father would come home on the weekends. But then he became rather sickly after about 3 years. My mother knew what was happening, that you didn't ever tell me. You have something called lupus. It makes you really weak. Your joints hurt, kind of like having arthritis. And he came home to stay for 2 weeks before he died. Everybody made out that it was kind of like a sudden illness and a sudden death. I kind of knew it wasn't, but I didn't know what the cause was. And little could I have imagined that 12 years later, I would be diagnosed with lupus. But once again, my mother didn't tell me. Somebody else did. In a small town, there was no Catholic school either, so I went to a progressive school. It was what they called a lab school connected to what was then called Georgia State College for Women. Now it has a really name, Georgia State College and University, because they can't make up their mind which they are. And they had a teacher program, so we got all the new stuff in progressive education. When I got to high school, I still didn't know too many people because I was new in town. So I got on the newspaper staff. And I did two kinds of things. I did cartoons, because I thought I was going to be a cartoonist. And then gradually I began to write more and more articles. Now, one of the things you might know about cartoons, if you're putting them out there in the public domain, is when you do public figures, you can make them identifiable by exaggerating their physical features. You don't really have to have a tag that says President Obama. You get a kind of small round face and big ears that stick out like wings. Then you know who that is, right? And I think maybe some of that carried over into my writing with the kinds of characters that I created, is that they were exaggerations. In the South, we call them grotesques. There are a lot of Southern writers, like William Faulkner, who used grotesques. And a woman I don't like, but she was my contemporary, Carson McCullers, used grotesques. As soon as high school was over, I immediately enrolled in Georgia State. Didn't even give myself a vacation. It was easy to commute because college was right across the street from the house we lived in. Still called the Klein House. That was my mother's maiden name. And she was always known as Regina Klein. And in Milledgeville, everybody knew me as Mary Flannery. When I later moved away, I decided I didn't like this two-name Southern bit, so I asked my mother to be okay if I went by Flannery, and she said fine. It was really the last name from somewhere else in my family. It was convenient because if people in Milledgeville didn't like my literature, they didn't know Mary Flannery had written it. My first collection of short stories I dedicated to my friends up in Connecticut, the Fitzgeralds. Somebody asked why I didn't dedicate it to my family, and I said, well, if they connected my stories to my family, we'd have to move out of town. So there were reasons to change my name a bit. Might have been the natural thing to do, but there was an English teacher there that I didn't like. And so I went to sociology instead. I wrote for the newspaper there and did cartoons all the way through. So I was 20 years old when I finished college and went off to Iowa University of Iowa, I guess that's the right order. And initially I was signed up for journalism. thought I was going to be a newspaper writer. Then one day I went to talk to a man named Paul Engel. Paul Engel headed up the Iowa Writers Workshop, pretty famous workshop. Lots of famous writers have gone through there or taught there. I went in to talk to Paul Engel and told him who I was and what I was interested in, and he said, "Would you say that over again?" So I said it again, and he finally pulled out a pad of paper and said, "Would you write it down?" He didn't think I was speaking plain English, and I thought those people in Iowa spoke pretty funny English. And so I wrote down, "I am a writer." That kind of got his attention, he told me later, because most students would come in and say, "I want to be a writer." And I said, "I am a writer." And so he quickly invited me into the workshop. And it was several weeks. I had to have some kidney surgery. Several weeks passed before I got back. Next Christmas I went back again. This time I got really sick on the train. Ended up in the hospital. And that was when the doctor said to my mother, "She has lupus." But Mama didn't ever tell me that. Finally, I started to feel better. I went back up to Connecticut to be with the Fitzgeralds. But some things still weren't going well. And one day, my friend turned to me and said, "Flannery, your mother won't tell you, and don't tell your mother I told you, but you have lupus." Eventually, and not long after that, I moved back to Georgia, where I stayed most of the rest of my life. Until then, my mother had lived in the Klein house, but all the bedrooms were in the upper levels of the house, where that meant climbing stairs. And as you can see from my flying buttresses, that could be a challenge here. So we moved out to the family farm, which was about 5-6 miles north of Milledgeville. It's called Andalusia. I don't know why it was called that, but somebody started calling it that back in the 19th century. It's begun calling it something else, and then I found out that the first name had been Andalusia, and we thought, this is cool, so it's still called Andalusia. There, my bedroom was on the main floor, so I didn't have too many stairs to climb. Just the steps up into the house. In fact, I think I have some pictures here I'll pass around, and you can see the steps. Thank you, young man. And there too, unless I was having real flare-ups with the lupus, I would write in the mornings, we would have lunch. Sometimes we'd go into town, eat at a little restaurant there, sometimes we ate at home. Afternoon, I have this is the total volume in these books of my literature. I did write some other stuff, some essays. And this volume, collected by my friend Sally Fitzgerald, they're just about the same thickness. And more recent scholars have found out that she skipped some of my letters. She never included any of the letters I wrote to my mother. And there was some that I think Sally thought didn't fit me too well, so she politely left them out. I suppose that's okay, she meant well. If you think in terms of sports, she was probably the leading cheerleader of my rally squad. I didn't always stay at Andalusia. There was some pay if I went around the colleges and spoke. So sometimes we managed to group 2 or 3 schools together in the same area and go. Sometimes I gave short lectures. I had several titles that I kept using over and over. I guess I believe in recycling even then. Like the Catholic writer in the South. Being a Catholic in the South was kind of like being a Jew at Mass, I guess. Most of the South is Protestant from one end to the other. So, in fact, at one time, it was not legal to be a Catholic and live in Georgia. Anyway, sometimes I would read one or more of my stories. My favorite one, to read, and it's one you've read, is A Good Man Is Hard to Find. Another one that I liked a lot was Good Country People. And from what I understand, you haven't been assigned that one to help relieve the pain and inflammation of lupus. The doctors were reluctant to operate because they feared that this would stir up the lupus again. But finally, this fibroid tumor reached the point where they had to do something. I wrote to one of my friends that the doctors had the choice of remove the tumor and save me, or maybe remove me and keep the tumor. Well, they took the first option. But then the lupus came back viciously. And I spent the last month or so of my life in the hospital. I'm told not to do anything, but when people weren't looking, I was still writing my letters. When I died, 3rd of August, 1964, they found this one still unfinished letter in the drawer beside my bed. Now maybe you'd like to ask Flannery some questions. She was one to encourage people who wanted to be published writers. And so a number of the people that she wrote to were young writers on their way to publication, or they hoped they were going there. One name that shows up frequently is a woman named Cecil Dawkins. It's interesting how many people women in the South had names that sound like they should be masculine. It's not Cecile, it's spelled C-E-C-I-L, Dawkins. A couple of the people that she wrote to, or one person that she wrote to, had been an atheist, so was interested in having a religious conversation by letter. She became Catholic. That didn't stick very long. And she disavowed the church. But they continued their letter writing. talking about matters of common interest, sometimes religion, sometimes not. There was a woman named Marriott, M-A-R-Y-A-T, last name Lee. By this point, Marriott's brother was the president of the college in Milledgeville. Marriott was an interesting person because she was so different in almost all respects to Flannery. Flannery was this deeply rooted Catholic. She described herself at one point as being a 13th century Catholic. Now it will come to me. But I have a story where, it has the N word in it, the artificial N, okay? And what I tried to portray in the story, and I've said it more explicitly elsewhere, was this little yard ornament of a black figure working was my attempt to symbolize all of the pain and suffering that had been placed upon the black person in this country. More naturally and gradually, and Marriott believed in pass the damn legislation right now and get it over with, get on with it. And in the last 7 or 8 years of my life, if you've read your history, you know that those were very interesting and troubling times in the South. So anyway, she and Marriott, Marriott and I, forget who I am, have multiple personality disorder. Marriott and I would have these discussions about the right way to do these things. Well, we loved each other dearly. Visit her brother. But we had a fast and furious discussion of many things. An English teacher, a humanist, wrote me one time and asked about another of my stories, why I named the main character their kind of a Christmas-themed program on television. And after the show started, we said, well, we remember this woman, she was in a series several years ago where she was the owner of a bookstore and she solved murder mysteries. So I looked up her name. As I said, the last time we saw her, she was expecting her first child. This is an element of the South. You get some of the Gothic and, as I say, Faulkner. You get it in Carson McCullers. Her as a lonely hunter probably shows up less in her, maybe the best known member of the wedding. Dora Welty has some elements of it, but she has a little more comedy than the other writers. It's almost a part of that ethos. One of her favorite writers, and this might explain it, was Edgar Allan Poe. Quotes the Raven, nevermore. Well, Poe would be certainly, her reading list is quite interesting. What's his first name? Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was a Jesuit priest. And she read his book, The Phenomenon of Man. He was real borderline as far as the Catholic Church was concerned. The Church told him, no more publishing, Pierre. He was trained as a geologist, and he worked in China for a number of years. And if you have an anthropological bent, you may know about had something called the Peking Man. Now we'd have to call him the Beijing Man. He was working in that project in China. And the title of her second collection of short stories, All That Rises Must Converge, is a line taken from Taber de Sheridan. She read Martin Buber, a Jewish theologian, mystic. A couple of others have come to mind, or aren't coming to mind. She wrote to a friend of hers one time and said, well, I just finished reading this book by Buber. Those Jewish boys have a good head on them, she said. Another that showed up on her list was Bernard Malamud, who you may or may not know spent several years teaching at Oregon State. My first 4 years of teaching after receiving my master's were at Oregon State, and somebody said this was where he would go when he was writing. Nobody would knock on his door. I thought it was really exciting. I got some junk mail with his name on it. He was already gone by that point. I think went to Bennington and was there the rest of his teaching career.
Didn't leave a forwarding address.
Well, he was findable, and he would come back and read because he had many friends in the department. So she read pretty widely. And then she would, be assigned, read this book and review it for our diocesan letter, or newsletter. So she read in theology. It was pretty sophisticated. Read widely in literature.
Or some like some man or maybe the lack of, like, how that played in her stories or letters.
Well, the easy thing to answer is the second part.
Yeah.
You don't find any torrid romances in her stories. So if you need the true romance, then this is not the author that you read. Somebody commented that in one of her stories she does have a character who visits a place where women have a special kind of entertainment for men. I'll put it as euphemistically as I can. And somebody who knew her quite well said, I really don't want to tell her she has no idea what those places are like, because of course she hadn't been there. As for love interests, only 2 names ever came up, and neither of them seemed to have been more than good friends. While she was at Georgia State College, there was a military program being conducted on the same campus. That was not unusual during World War II. And she became acquainted with a guy who was headed for the Navy. And they would eat out together, they would take walks together, they would talk about writing and so forth. And I think she continued to correspond with him while he was abroad.